Thank you everyone for coming. We are going to get started in just a moment here, right at noon, but I appreciate y'all for hopping in a little early. Thank you for spending, well, I guess if you're in the central time zone, like I am, thank you for spending your lunch break with us. All right, it's 12 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. For all of our attendees, welcome. I'm Haley Ross Young, and I am the Division 18 Community and State Hospital Section Secretary Treasurer. So I'll be moderating this meeting today. And I have Ron Unger here. I see someone in the chat asking if the camera is working. Can others who are attending see? Okay, others are able to see. Okay, fantastic. So to the person who asked that question, maybe log out and back in again. Apologize for the disruption to our introduction. But we are very excited to welcome, we can't see other attendees or myself. Yes, we have it set up so that you can just see the panelists. And once Ron shares his screen, you'll just be able to see his slides. We're excited to have with us Ron Unger today. He is a licensed clinical social worker with a lot of expertise in the area of treating trauma and psychosis. This is the third in a series of webinars that he was kind enough to host for our section. So we're excited to have you all here today and to hear what he has to say. So as I mentioned, I'll be moderating the chat and the Q&A. So if you have questions or comments as we go, feel free to drop them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll spend the last 10 to 15 minutes, with Ron answering your questions. Additionally, I dropped a link to our feedback survey at the top of the chat. I will also drop it in again towards the end of our meeting. We would appreciate if folks would fill that out afterwards. So Ron, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Well, thanks very much. Let me see if I can get this going. Sure. All right. One more thing. Sorry, just a second. Yeah. So I'm going to start with saying a little bit about what is dissociation, and I think we can use something like the DSM-5 definition, just a disruption of or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. That's quite a list. That can potentially disrupt every area of psychological functioning. Now that does make it sound like dissociation is just something disruptive, but the interesting thing is that it can also be understood as a coping strategy. But like a lot of coping strategies, it can lead to problems if it's overdone or various kinds of problems can come up. And it's also been found something that is, seems to be universal in different cultures. Different cultures have different styles of dissociation. But it does seem to be universal and does seem to be like when people experience trauma, they do more dissociation. In some cultures, it might be more likely to manifest as possession states or other kinds of stuff. Interestingly, some researchers have found that in a population sample of African-American people, and to a lesser extent, Asian people in the US, having a higher dissociation score was associated with lower psychological distress. And that's maybe associated with what various Black leaders and scholars have called double consciousness. And that arises out of the difference between how others might see you, especially more racist people, negatively, and the positive view you might have of yourself. And this distinction then gets internalized as two alternate and coexisting views of yourself. So the double consciousness like that can be understood to be a protective response that helps preserve some positive feelings and a sense of positive identity, even in the face of adverse experiences from a racist society. But having that same kind of split identity has also been identified as a risk factor for psychosis. So we're going to try to understand some of that today. So looking at, there's a meta-analysis that was done looking at the relationship between psychotic symptoms and dissociation. And definitely found that the more severe any aspects of childhood trauma had been, the more severe dissociative symptoms seemed to be in people with psychosis, and with an emotional abuse seeming to have the strongest effects. And then greater dissociation has been associated with a wide variety of what are considered psychotic symptoms. For example, strongly linked to what's called hallucinations across multiple sensory modalities. There's also large associations with what gets called paranoia and delusions. And there are significant links with disorganization, though that was a somewhat smaller magnitude. And then dissociation was not consistently linked with negative symptoms. And to some extent, negative symptoms might come more out of a coping strategy that's an alternative to dissociation, where there's a general downregulation of emotion and social engagement. At least that's one way they conceptualized it. So now what I want to try to do is just try to follow the process by which people go from trauma to dissociation, and then how it potentially causes problems. So one thing that's helpful to look at is just how trauma naturally leads to a narrow focus. When we're feeling safe, we have a wide variety of interests and flexibility in our behavior. We make space in our life for a variety of activities and pursuits. We see things in a more nuanced way. In an acceptance and commitment therapy I went to, I heard this described using a bunny rabbit example. So we were asked to picture this bunny in a field, and it had a wide range of interests, various bushes to taste and smelling the air for what the other bunnies were up to and working on its burrow or whatever. And then it smells a fox. And at that point, its interests narrow to doing whatever might be necessary to survive the threat. So it starts seeing things in a very black and white way. There's what will lead to survival and what won't. And so lots of interests and even needs may have to be sacrificed to, do what needs to be done to survive, at least for a while. And then what happens, if the rabbit does escape the fox and the fox goes away? Well, those of you familiar with Peter Levine's work know that, mammals, they just kind of go through this process of shaking it off, come back to their normal wide range of interests and go back about their business, being the happy bunny in the field. But more complex situations are not so easily resolved, especially when there's conflicting threats. So let's say the fox just hangs out nearby until the rabbit is starving in its burrow. Now it has maybe two kinds of focus battling within the organism. One is the urge to escape the fox, and the other is the urge to escape starvation. Actually, torturers actually deliberately get a person's needs set against each other to create this kind of split. But a common cause that happens in people is what's called betrayal trauma, when a child is abused by a parent or caretaker. And basically the kid is experiencing, I have to get away from this person hurting me and who might destroy me, but also I have to bond with and trust this person because otherwise I have no help in the world. And that kind of thing really gets going a lot of dissociative splits. A fairly well-known story that illustrates this pretty well, I think, was told by a former Miss America, Marilyn Van Derber. And she was abused by her father, and she talked about how in response she formed basically two selves. One self was her daytime self, and that was organized around things like her need to fit in and achieve and act like things were okay and please her parents. It was kind of a fake okay self. She had to kind of pretend that the predator, her dad, was not threatening to her so she could keep her life moving forward. But her other self, she called her nighttime self, and that was organized around the need to cope with her father's abuse of her and to look for ways to survive that abuse. Now, notice that each part is to some extent a threat to the other. To her daytime self, recalling her father's abuse and getting defensive would get in the way of being the charming and talented girl and then woman that she was becoming. But to her nighttime self, it was being focused on the threat that was what was important, and anything that downplayed the threat was dangerous because it meant, she might not protect herself. Now, when she was a kid, she was aware of this split, but she made a deal with herself. Hey, once we get away and are safe, we're going to come back together and heal. But then once she did become an adult, she just decided she didn't need that messed up nighttime self, and she'd just bury it or get rid of it. And that worked okay until the dissociated nighttime self started to cause her episodes of paralysis that sent her to a psychiatric hospital. So later she had to find a way to actually work on integration, which was more scary and difficult, though that's what she needed to come back to being a whole person. So like Marilyn, when a person's not integrated, they tend to organize around one reaction or strategy, while the other one will be missing, or at other times the missing strategy will come back in as some form of intruder or being intrusions. In her case, it came in the form of episodes of paralysis. And then sometimes there's a flipping back from one strategy to the other. And this split is kind of at the core, both in people that get diagnosed with PTSD and psychosis, I think. So one way this kind of split has been talked about is structural dissociation and trauma theory. So this split tends to be one of the parts has been called the apparently normal part, or even abbreviated A&P. And this part is kind of like identifies with daily life motivations, trying to get on with daily life as though the trauma didn't exist and avoiding any upsetting memories or emotions. But then the other part is, has been called the emotional part, or EP, but that's the part that's focused on the trauma and trying to avoid it happening again. And so it can be very intensely emotional. So note that each of these parts is an answer for the problem caused by the other part. The emotional part gets too worked up and is too reactive and interferes with daily life. So the apparently normal part tries to suppress that. But the apparently normal part is, oblivious to the threat and isn't attending to it. And so, the emotional part tends to fight with it. The apparently normal part is also kind of like what a lot of people often sense as a false self. It looks like a whole person, but it really isn't. Its coherence is based on blocking out part of the self or parts of the person's experience. If we think of the apparently normal part as the real person, we might see our goal in mental health treatment being to take its side and to fight with the emotional part and to work on suppressing it, suppress any intrusions or flashbacks or voices or any other symptoms of falling apart. And when we think in terms of mental illness, it's easy to start thinking of the apparently normal part as the person versus their illness, which is the emotional part that needs to be suppressed. But if we're more interested in helping the person find and center on their whole self, or find that balance of their whole self, then the fact that the A&P, or apparently normal part, is not complete is actually a helpful thing to realize, so that you can work towards that true balance. I've probably heard people like Leonard Cohen and Rumi talk about the cracks that let the light in, and in fact, sometimes when our false self shows cracks, that's actually an opportunity for healing. Now, some people will frame it that dissociative splits only happen in some people while others are whole. But I find it more helpful to think of everyone as having these splits to some degree. But there can be a great difference, of course, in how much is split off and how chronic or entrenched these kind of splits are. So this slide is from, just my basic seminar on CBT for psychosis, going on with kind of everyday problems. And so usually people have problems when they're going on one of these two extremes. And one of the extremes is when they're letting their emotions or thoughts have too much power. So maybe they feel down, so they feel like, oh, everything is terrible, I'm feeling down. Or they feel scared, so they assume that means they're in danger. Maybe they're in the grocery store and they feel scared, and so, oh, I've just got to get out of here, and leave or something like that. So let the emotions take over. So that causes trouble. So people often go to the opposite extreme of just trying to push away their emotions or thoughts or whatever, and they try to block out those feelings of anxiety, or take drugs so they go away, or drink alcohol so they go away. And it's pretty common for that sort of thing to happen, whereas what we really want in mental health is for people to be able to have both sides of them, like have the feelings, but not let them have too much power. Sometimes, you get more into your feelings, sometimes more stepping back and considering them. I often talk about this. There's this silly movie that had a line in it that feelings are like children. It doesn't work to lock them in the trunk, but it doesn't work to let them drive the car, but it also doesn't work to lock them in the trunk. So there's that basic idea, we need to be with the parts of us without necessarily letting them take over, because we want to be driving the car in a balanced way. Really it's natural to not be completely balanced. We all sometimes get briefly taken over by feelings, mood states, impulses. And sometimes we're more stepped back from our feelings and moods and all that. But what happens this nice, smooth, fluid back and forth way, we don't really notice it as a problem. It's just when the swings get bigger and the middle ground can't be found, that's when the problems become severe. And then we get to where we either have, dissociated stuff that's kind of walled off, and we're avoiding too much, or we get flooded by it and disrupted and taken over. So kind of an interesting thing that happens is that whatever we don't integrate and into our minds and lives can take on kind of a life of its own. And that's kind of like the phenomena of self-organization, which is really found at various levels. And there's a lot of interesting science around self-organization. But when it happens with dissociated mental stuff, we could call it sub-self organization. So a traditional understanding of madness is like being possessed by evil spirits, and the evil spirits have a life of their own. A lot of people will still talk about it that way, right? But a dissociative understanding of it is, has quite a few similarities with that, really, because it's also about having stuff within our mind that kind of has a life of its own. And often it's stuff that the person doesn't feel should be there. It's just that dissociation, with dissociation seen as the origin, it's a reaction to experiences that the person couldn't integrate or hasn't yet been able to integrate, rather than a kind of like supernatural explanation. Now, Eleanor Longden, a lot of you have probably seen her TED Talk, but she explained that her period of psychosis along those lines, she said she had good reason to want to bury the memories and the parts of her that, terrible things that happened to, and that focused on those terrible things. But the problem was she buried those things alive, and they didn't stay buried. So, they have a life of their own. So what hasn't been integrated yet might be kind of just simple stuff to very complex. So, it might just be fragments of memory or emotion or impulses that we've buried, or it might be whole sub-personalities, or what some people call alters, like the daytime and nighttime self of the Miss America that I mentioned earlier. Or, and sometimes, that process of what it might be parts of the mind that might be identified by the person as, and they might even self-identify as something external to the person. Like they might even say that they're demons or aliens or whatever. But the dynamic might be similar, though, just self-organization of dissociated content. Now, some of you might have been told at some point or another that psychotic disorders like schizophrenia should be seen as completely unrelated with dissociative disorders. And that's because, as Colin Ross has put it, any notion of a relationship between dissociation and psychosis appears to have been dissociated in much of the mental health system. And that's despite the fact that the more symptoms a person has that have often been considered to be unique to schizophrenia, the more likely they are to have a lot of dissociation or even dissociative identity disorder. And certain symptoms that have been at times considered the most clear indicators of schizophrenia, like a voice giving running commentary on one's thoughts, or two or more voices conversing with each other, or delusions which have been classified as bizarre, such as the belief that someone's taking over one's body. Those are all pretty typical within dissociative identity disorder itself. It's interesting to look at that last one. It was the DSM-4, I think, that said that if you fear something is trying to take over your body, that can be considered a bizarre delusion. But then if something does take over your body and you don't have memories of what happened for hours or days or whatever, well, that's a symptom of dissociative identity disorder. Obviously, if such takeovers really do happen, then worrying about them can't be too bizarre. So at least they shouldn't classify it as a bizarre delusion. It's also common in dissociative identity disorder to have alters conversing with each other. I mean, many professionals will state that, if they're dissociative voices, they're different. But, when they actually tried to look into that, they couldn't find good evidence of that. There's a whole range of variety of voices in both disorders. One difference, of course, you might see is a difference of interpretation. The person interprets the voice as a demon or something coming in by telepathy. They're more likely to get diagnosed with a psychotic disorder. Also more disorganization, more likely be diagnosed as psychosis. But the similarities in the dissociation being involved, I think, can be still a common factor. And so don't make too much of diagnostic categories. Also, a lot of people get at one point diagnosed with schizophrenia, later dissociative identity disorder or whatever. There's a lot of crossover. And also, I guess one thing that if the voice does take over a person and cause gaps in their memory, then dissociative identity disorder is also more likely to be diagnosed, whereas a lot of people hear voices and they never take over. Now, some people will say, well, one way you can tell is if it's dissociative identity disorder, then antipsychotics won't work. But in fact, it's more nuanced than that. They still might work sometime. It's really more on a continuum. Research in general shows that antipsychotics are less effective for people that have had, a lot of childhood trauma. And maybe that's because the feeling of being unsafe is more deeply rooted in people that have had a lot of trauma. So it's harder for a drug to mask that. Now, seeing this connections between diagnosis and psychosis, between dissociation and psychosis, can be very helpful in trying to understand and follow some of the strange experiences our clients might have, which often aren't the relatively well-organized experiences which might be, diagnosed as dissociative identity disorder, but which still are strongly related on a continuum with that. So, for example, voices, we commonly run into people who clearly fit a psychotic disorder diagnosis, but yet they have their voices sometimes take over and talk through them. The person will find the voices just kind of speaking through them. In some cases, take over their body and do things. Or what was seen as a voice becomes later, seen as a separate personality, and then maybe later becomes just seen as part of the person. So an example that crosses a lot of this territory, I worked with this guy, before before I saw him, he developed this voice that claimed to be some kind of high spiritual being, and he'd do whatever it said because he believed it was very spiritually powerful. Then at some point, the voice admitted to him that it was making stuff up to help him be less gullible. And it was actually the voice that told him he should go to a psychiatrist. A little unusual there. So then, he also started seeing me, and then he started reporting that the voice was taking over some of the time. And at that point, he was going back to school, and he appreciated that the voice, at least when it took over, it would still do his homework. But then he started saying the voice was taking control more of the time. And so when he'd come in for a session, I'd ask him, well, is it you or is it the voice? And sometimes it would be the voice. And so we'd continue to have a session. I just kind of normalized it. Well, this seems like it's another side of you. And I encouraged working out disputes between like the voice here and the voice by, having them consider each other's needs. Like the voice here would say, well, the voice takes over, it smokes too much and it won't keep up with my friends. And so I'd bring that up with the voice, hey, you could, get along better. And eventually they did start getting along better. And, and he left therapy before this was really all resolved, but I saw him years later and he reported, hey, now I just feel like one person, no big split. It was doing a lot better. Interestingly enough, at some point in this discussion, this client was aware of dissociative identity disorder, but said, oh, that couldn't be me because I didn't have trauma. But then later, as we were talking, turned out there was quite a bit of trauma. Anyway, it gets complicated. So dissociation itself is kind of complex. And that's why I wanted to bring up this conceptualization of two types of dissociation. This is negative and positive, not that one is necessarily desirable versus the other, but one is more something absent and one is something present. So negative is like when something is being successfully buried, that's considered negative dissociation. It's just missing. So there might be memories missing or emotions that are missing or various kinds of things. And positive dissociation is considered when what had been pushed away is actually pushing back in some often in like a very disorderly way. Bill O'Hanlon explains these concepts with an analogy involving roommates who get into a fight. So they get in a fight and maybe they kick out one of the roommates who's then is absent when people come looking for him. Oh, where's Joe? Oh, he's not here. And that's the negative dissociation. At other times, let's say the roommate that got kicked out tries coming back in. Hey, I paid my rent. I belong to be here. Let me in. And at that point, it's disruptive. It's what, there's an intrusion. It's what's called positive dissociation. And so, so you can have both of those. And what's positive, and in some sense, like, each, there's a time and place for each one, like sometimes we do need some separation, like, and so pushing, let's say, traumatic memories away a bit could be healthy up to a point. And sometimes though, turning and bringing them together, like, hey, let's let that back in. Let's, it's risky and messy, but it may be really important in order to start taking some steps towards healing. They're both kind of like contradictory directions, but each one has some potential value if not overdone and at the right time and place. So again, this is, and the pendulation going back and forth is often a key part of working with trauma. So sometimes it's stepping away from the trauma, sometimes it's turning and facing it. I think sometimes we get too much caught up in trying to just push it away. So in trying to work towards healing, I'm going to start talking about some general principles of working towards healing, then I'm going to talk about some more specifics. But the two sides of it, we really need both boundaries, like not let the trauma take over our life, or the parts of us that are like, hypervigilant around trauma. We don't want those having too much influence, or the voice or whatever. but we also need to have some openness to it. If the boundary, we try to make it too much like a wall with no way of getting through it, that's not, that is not so great. So we want to really incorporate these two contradictory strategies. And this is really just kind of like what's needed in family relations as well. We need to have, boundaries with other people, but we also need to have some openness to hearing about their interests and concerns and find ways to share space. Of course, a lot of people, work on how to help people integrate. There's internal family systems as an approach that some of you might be familiar with. So it's trying to have the equivalent of healthy family relationships inside. We need to find a way to have these contradictory strategies, live together, work together, instead of narrowing down to say, well, one is the good part and the other is the bad part. It's more like, well, maybe they both have, good and bad things about them, and how can they fit together? How can we find value in all the parts of ourselves, while not letting any part be too dominant? Because that's where the boundaries come in. And getting there, so people do need often help setting limits with intrusions or the disturbing or polarized parts of their psyche. But the tricky part is helping people do that while also staying open to hearing about and addressing the underlying concerns that those parts represent. And it's that second step that, is often missing, I think, in mental health treatment, especially if the disturbing part is seen as the symptom of an illness. If instead we see it as, oh, it's understandable part of the person, it's maybe trying to, let's say, make sure that the trauma doesn't reoccur. Might not be doing that in a very realistic way, but if we can at least be open to those concerns, oh, I see where you're coming from. Hey, that's an important concern. And we can start actually relating better with those parts. So in doing that, I put two vital ingredients. One is that just allowing more than one part to be heard. Like the more we can practice, allowing different parts of the psyche or even, voices to be heard in some way. And what are the concerns underneath them that, again, remember what I said, like with feelings, you don't want them driving the car, but you also don't want to lock them in the trunk. So when they're not in the trunk, they can speak, right? And then having compassion. And that is a balanced compassion, like each part needs to learn how to have compassion towards itself, but also towards the other parts, kind of, and even towards parts of the self that are seen as potentially harmful. We need to work on ways not to let those parts cause harm, but also have some concern for them. So one way to approach this is to just take standard CBT for psychosis, but really work on weaving in addressing dissociation within it. And it's been observed that talking about or addressing dissociation is often missing in CBT for psychosis. But in a small study where they did attempt that, they deliberately worked at weaving addressing dissociation in. They got some great results. And that's what this slide is about. It just it shows a standard kind of like CBT formulation, and then how you might talk about, noticing that, the cognitive behavioral responses include dissociation, post-traumatic intrusions, relate to dissociation, and then how you interpret them. Of course, once people start understanding how dissociation works and how it might be working, they have a lot of more options for coping with it. So in the improvements that were noted in the study were, in measures of dissociation and problems with voices, Problems with what got called delusions were less severe, post-traumatic symptoms less, just general anxiety, depression, and stress was less. And there were some other user-developed measures of therapy effectiveness that had positive results, and gains maintained at 6-month follow-up. So that's pretty good. So, what all did they do? Well, one thing they did is they normalized dissociation as a response, kind of explained what it was and how it's normal, and and then they introduced and practiced a range of techniques to manage those kind of responses and to help the person feel more like they could be in some kind of control while this stuff was going on. Identify triggers, distress tolerance, and grounding techniques. And then once they did some basic work, they kind of like worked with the person to figure out what were the most likely next steps. So that, depended on individual formulation of the client's difficulties, what was acceptable to the client. Sometimes, people want to really work directly on the trauma. Other times they might, it might make more sense just to work more on beliefs about dissociative experiences, or sometimes it might be beliefs about voices. There's different kinds of things that, it's good to have a range of options of what you know how to do. So, one of the things I think that is helpful, and I want to talk a little bit more now, is something drawn from the hearing voices movement, but it's something that can also be brought into basic CBT to sometimes go further towards addressing dissociative splits. And that's, explicitly working on the relationship between the voice hearer and their voices. Because these approaches go beyond either the medical model goal of trying to suppress or eliminate the voices, or the traditional CBT model of helping people cope with the voices. And instead, we're actually working on maybe making peace with, or even integrating, the parts of the person's mental process that have been causing the voices or presenting as the voices. And kind of like remembering that integration is the opposite of dissociation. So how can we really integrate what's been going on with the voices? Now, normally what we see is either people working on trying to suppress or ignore voices. That's very common. That's trying to basically enforce what we earlier talked about as negative dissociation, keeping the voices out of the picture mostly. Or we see people getting distressed and agitated about the voices, or maybe letting the voices have too much power. They're believing what the voices say, or maybe even obeying the voices when the voices are ordering harmful things. And that's more on the side of what we may call positive dissociation. And because that's so dysfunctional, when people do have those kind of relationships with voices, that often the person and the mental health system then turns back and says, well, we need something like negative dissociation. We need to suppress or block out those voices. But I think what works better is helping the person develop an assertive, yet respectful and curious and compassionate style of relating to the voice, or what might be behind the voice. And I say what might be behind the voice because sometimes voices themselves are kind of stubborn. They say the same thing over and over. Or they aren't very relational. But sometimes if a person gets curious what's behind it, they can start identifying some feelings and concerns and parts of themselves, and then relate directly to that when the voice pops up. And that can be where the healthy relationship comes in. So there's just lots of options for how to go about this. Sometimes, we might focus more on coaching and even role playing with the person and how to assertively yet calmly stand up to a voice. And that's especially important when people are getting pushed around by the voice or getting agitated in response to it. And that's the approach that has especially been developed in a professional way called relating therapy. which you can, Mark Hayward is the big guy behind that. But other times the focus might be more on helping the person become curious about the voice, or even compassionate around how the voice might be suffering. If the voice is representing parts of them, maybe there's some suffering in those parts. And to have, be curious about how they might actually work on resolving the conflict with the voice. And we might coach the person on how to approach the voice that way. Now, then another thing that some of you might have already heard about is, as on the slide, it says voice dialogue. And that's the option where sometimes the therapist or helper can actually talk, relatively directly with the voice, like just ask the person, I want to ask the voice a question. And you can either, speak the answer or tell me what you hear the voice saying, and have a little back and forth dialogue that way, which can help bring in some of this curiosity and exploration. And though I think a lot of it is helping the person approach the voice directly, and this kind of more assertive, respectful, curious, and compassionate way. It's a lot to balance there, but once people can do that, relationships really tend to get better. This is all kind of like family therapy, When a voice hearer comes in, we see just one person in our therapy room or our Zoom session, but really there's more than one consciousness in a sense there. The voice is often listening and having views about what's going on. And it's often helpful to bring that into the therapy, just like you would if a person came in for family therapy and had a relative tagging along. You'd say, hey, is interested in including this person in the session? And especially if it's someone they've been having a lot of trouble with. It can be an interesting process. Of course, I'm just kind of introducing the idea here. We're not going to be able to talk about all of how to do that. But one person that's done a lot of work on this, again, Eleanor Longden, I mentioned her earlier, she's really been a leader in bringing voice dialogue and compassion-focused approach into clinical work. In her TED Talk, she shared her own journey from being intimidated by voices to learning to be less scared of them, to figuring out how to be assertive yet respectful with them, and finally figuring out how each voice seemed related to some part of herself, with the most aggressive voices being connected with parts of herself that had been most hurt during the time when she'd been traumatized. I think it's also interesting that, Eleanor Longden talks about, well, what's the best way of handling and quieting people who might be upset with you? And she'd say, well, is the best way trying to, push them into a locked room and ignore them? Or is it really best to, turn towards them and meet with them and ask about their concerns and talk about how you might work things out? Problem with trying to push them into that locked room is they may not stay there. And when they come out, they'll be even more pissed. So anyway, she's done some work around like having people do clinical work with dialoguing with voices, and really found out that could happen, and people like doing it. They haven't really yet done the research on effectiveness, but that will be forthcoming. And there's actually a lot of people interested in this kind of approach. Like Stanford is doing a 4.5-day Zoom seminar series coming up, which I think Haley already sent out the link to it. You might want to check that out to learn more about this kind of approach. Oh, sorry, I did not mean to do that. I had a video link there, but we don't have time for that. I want to look at a little bit about barriers, to dialogue with voices. And this is, some might be a barrier to the person themselves dialoguing with their voice, or to doing it within a therapy session. And it's important to understand the objections people might have and to work through them before trying to rush ahead and do any kind of work. And, because some people you'll be able to work through the barriers, and some people just won't want to work in that kind of way. But people do have choices about that. But some of those barriers are, sometimes people have been trained to strictly believe in a medical model, so it just makes no sense to them why they would want to talk to a voice. Some people believe that their voices are completely evil entities. Like, if someone's convinced the voice is Satan, why would they want to have a conversation with it? Sometimes people fear the power of the voice. They're just scared to engage with it. So you might have to work through those fears. Related is just fear, not of the voice directly, but fear of the emotion that might get stirred up if the person, makes contact with the voice or engages with it. And then people also might have shame about what the voices bring up. Like one person I'm working with has the voices bring up really intensely shameful images, which really disturb him. And it took a while to create the kind of safety that made him, feel that he could talk about that. Of course, then he's not lost in his shame if he can actually talk about what's happening. And sometimes it's just people worry that the voices might be too rude to the therapist, so making it like, hey, it's okay. I won't blame you if your voice is rude. So anyway, I know I've said a lot today. I hope I've said enough to stimulate your interest in learning more and to, just work with your colleagues to develop ways to deal with this kind of very important yet convoluted topic, which I think really is important to helping people heal. So, I guess we have some time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron. Well, right now we don't have questions, but I will encourage folks to drop them in the chat. We do have a comment. Someone noted that this was very helpful for them and their own conceptualization of psychosis and dissociative symptoms, saying that it also really helps recognize the spectrum that exists with the symptoms overlapping in the DSM-5 diagnoses, and that it validates their experience working with individuals with trauma and psychosis. And I see some comments from people saying, thank you for the presentation. I've dropped in the chat as well that the link to the training that you discussed will be going out in the email with the slides, if that is okay with you, and with the recording from this session.
Okay.
And then someone else commented, a key thing is to distinguish between nasty introjects versus parts of the person, and for both, the level of fear about each.
And now nasty introjects, I mean, that's kind of a tricky one. I know actually even in internal family systems, they say, well, some things are just introjects that aren't really part of the person, and you just need to, I think, I guess you could conceptualize it different ways. Often, like really, that people can have voices that are incredibly nasty, but they're still trying to be helpful. And sometimes you can identify, once the person can identify how the voice is trying to be helpful, it can become more like somebody that's going like overboard, like, hey, I know you're trying to warn me. It's okay. I've got my eye out for it, and work things out that way. Now, there might be other times when you never do find the positive intention of it, but you get in touch with other things that help you just let go of the kind of things that voice has been saying. And sometimes you might conceptualize it. Like, I know I've worked with people, like if something does seem just like a demon, well, maybe we can ask the demon to go somewhere where it would be more happy, and just sort of like imagine it going somewhere where it belongs. But yeah, it's a little, I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah. Someone else asked, dissociative subtypes with multiple EP and one ANP, how common is this?
I mean, it's certainly, relatively common. I mean, there's different variations, but when it's just kind of like seems like just one of each, like that Miss America had. That's probably relatively simple compared with what a lot of people have. And then of course, like if you know, how fine a lens do you use? Like what you use any of us on a really fine lens, we've got all these parts, right? Even though it may not be always important to conceptualize it that way, because if they're working okay together, there's no need to, you know, spend a lot of time trying to define everything into different parts.
Another question is, how do you address the barrier of one believing the voices are real people, quote unquote, harassing them electronically?
Yeah, that one can be tricky. It might depend on the specifics of what they're saying. That's where I might, you know, use some standard, more CBT kind of stuff. Sometimes, you know, that if it's people the person knows, they can often, if you can actually get the person relating with the actual person, they might be able to be less believing that the person that they're experiencing in their head is that person. Sometimes people will just say that's the only thing that could be going on. It has to be electronic, and just pointing out that, well, people have heard voices since, you know, we all have recorded history. It seems like voices have been able to manifest, might help a little bit. Yeah, it can be that definitely can be a tricky one. The more entrenched someone is in that, they might be less willing to work on it. You might first start by just helping them maintain their cool while those voices are there, you know, and able to stand up for themselves assertively, because they might yet be willing to think that the voice relates to themselves at all.
We had a question. Do you have any ideas for working with someone whose suicidal ideation has become a big part of their identity?
Yeah. It depends on the particulars, of course. A general idea I would have is just seeing what thinking of suicide is helping them escape from, and if they could find a way to face that with using less drastic strategies, that, you know, that would be a thing. Because often, you know, people's suicidal thoughts are a solution, right? We see them as a problem, but to the person themselves, they're like, oh, this is going to solve my problem. It's like if I knew I was going to be captured and horribly tortured to death, I would be kind of interested in suicide as an option to that.
Yeah. Another question is, without being able to attend a 4-day session, is there a more in-depth course of training available covering a half a day or a day for content like this?
We're talking with voices. Yeah, I don't know right now where that would be. But you know, Charlie Harriot Maitland has done a lot of work on compassion focused therapy, which includes some dialogue with voices. And Charlie and Eleanor wrote a self-help book, which I put on one of those slides, about you know, helping people relate to voices. And I know sometimes he offers training, so if you Google him, maybe you'd be able to find, and yeah, that might help.
Another question is, as someone entering the field of psychotherapy, I'm thinking about if I want to be a generalist or specialize in, let's say, dissociation and psychosis. I know that specialists seeing only clients with psychosis and dissociation or only depressed clients can lead to burnout. Any thoughts on this, and how do you manage that for yourself?
Well, I mean, I am so interested in it, I guess I tend not to burn out. I mean, obviously there's a lot of skills involved, and, you know, having boundaries about how much we take on and ourselves and how much we burden ourselves. I'd say you could start with it and then see how it's going and what kind of supports you need to take care of yourself. And you might find that it's actually quite interesting. I know some people that work a lot with people with complex problems, but don't have those problems of burning out just because they have, they have a way of relating to it and finding a lot of the work rewarding.
Someone asked, is there a place for bottom-up approaches in treating psychosis?
Bottom up approaches. I mean, I think it's good to have a lot of different strategies. I'm not clear exactly what that would mean, but there's definitely, I think it's often people put up obstacles to one way that you're trying. And so if you have a number of different tools in your toolbox, you can often negotiate, well, or we could try working on it this way, or we could approach it this way. And you find something that the person will, accept. And then once you get progress going in some ways, sometimes then the person becomes able to accept some other approach. So I've often used the analogy of a knot. You find some area where there's some wiggle room and loosen that up, and then maybe something else is a little looser. So,
in your opinion, when working with someone, would it matter whether they are experiencing voices that are internally generated or actual external spirits? Would the approach differ?
Or actual external what?
Spirits.
Oh, what they believe are spirits, because a person might see it all as inside their head, but believe that some of it is spirits, or the person might hear it outside their head and not believe it's spirits and just think it's their own thoughts coming in from outside, which some people do. If people are experiencing something as though it's being spoken to them from the outside, sometimes they actually believe it is someone from the outside. Like, for example, they might think, I'm hearing my neighbors through the wall. And in that case, you often have to help them figure out, well, is that really your neighbors through the wall? Because they're not going to be interested in internal psychological work until they, have ruled out, well, maybe it's not my neighbors. Then they're more interested in the psychological work.
Someone asked if you could give some examples or role play around how to reframe as helpful voices or hallucinations that the client perceives as assaulting them in the moment or during the session.
Yeah. So one of my clients, when she goes out, hears voices that call her nasty things and pretend to be other people. And one way of reframing as attempt to be helpful is just that part of her is scared for her to go out. And so they're trying to scare her into going back in because they're thinking that she needs that kind of protection. And so we're working with her to, when she sees that kind of thing going on, oh, part of me is scared right now. How can I can thank it for trying to protect me, but hey, I think I'm okay. I think I can handle this. And that's a kind of a reframe. Or Eleanor Longden would hear voices that said you're going to get killed tonight or something like that. And she learned to say, oh, thanks voices for letting me know I'm feeling insecure, but I think I can be okay.
Excellent. Someone else also asked, how much focus do you put on where the voice originates from versus the content of the voice and the amount of distress that it is causing the person?
Where it originates from, I'm not sure. I mean, you mean like maybe the experiences that set it off, maybe? I don't know, maybe that's what person was meaning. Because that's often very related to like why it might really be distressing them now, if you want to get into that in a little more detail. Often immediately I look at the immediate distress, but then I get curious about the whole picture of it. When did this voice come into your life? What was going on then? What maybe are the issues underneath the voice? All that kind of stuff is helpful.
Fantastic. Someone else asked, what would the approach be if someone is strongly invested in the belief that the voices/alters aren't parts of them and are fully other people?
Yeah, then I usually often work on just like what are skills that are good in dealing with other people, or even like the person is convinced the voice is a demon. Like, okay, well, maybe you could work on, being assertive with the demon, but in a calm way, because you don't want to get worked up. And maybe, hey, you can even practice kindness towards the demon. Like in this case, I'm working with a very Christian person. Well, you're supposed to love your enemies. Maybe you can, even though you don't want to give the demon any power, you can also kind of be kind to it. And hey, I'd like for you to go somewhere where you're happy or whatever. That can help. Excellent.
And then I'm actually dropping a training in the chat that is coming up. Sam Resnick was kind enough to share this. Charlie Harriet Maitland is actually doing a free webinar on case conceptualization in CFT. So if folks in attendance would like to attend, I just dropped that into the chat. So thank you for sharing that, Sam. Someone else asked, I'm wondering about how you might work with a way to distinguish between the voices that have spiritual content that is helpful and seems to come from a meaningful spiritual place versus the other voices that may be more fearful or have a mix and could be explored. I'm trying to not invalidate spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's just where discernment comes in. I mean, it's in a lot of spiritual traditions, it's understood that you have to use discernment when you hear something. Hey, is this coming from a, how can you feel into it? Does this seem like it would have like good consequences if you followed it? And just help the person develop discernment is what I would work on. Because yeah, sometimes, I tell people, hey, if your voice says something useful, because sometimes people have voices that cause lots of trouble, but other times they remind them of things, remind them of appointments, or other times they might really say things that help them, in a really big way in their life that like you would think a spiritual breakthrough might help. So there's this whole range of possibilities.
This will be our last question because we're right at time. Someone asked, voices mumbled through outside noises, such as a faucet running, how to make more clear to engage and do the internal third person conversations. Are they considered introjects as well?
Oh, if they just mumble, what do you do? Yeah, sometimes then you really just look underneath, like when do I tend to have these kind of experiences? What maybe is going on with me emotionally? Or you could invite the voices to speak up more clearly. Or you could just look at the emotions. I know of one client that, her voices aren't that clear, but she just knows, well, I start hearing voices, it's probably stressed. I need to look at what's stressing me out, that kind of thing.
Fantastic. Well, we're actually a little after 1. So thank you, Ron, for taking the time to answer everyone's questions. Everyone was really thankful and appreciative for that and for all that you shared today in the presentation. For those who are still here, please, if you get the chance, complete our feedback survey and be looking for your email follow up next week that will have the link to the recording as well as the slides and the link to the training that Ron discussed. So thank you again, everyone who is able to be in attendance. And I hope you have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.
Yep. Thanks everybody
Thank you
for
again,
attending.
Ron.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.